Wilmot's Mayor Natasha Saladin.
I do live at home with my parents.
Despite earning around $90,000 a year, she can't afford a home in the municipality she leads.
Unfortunately, now this seems to be par for the course. What we're seeing right now is first-time home buyers, especially, are really being affected, and there's a huge barrier to entering the market right now.
I met a carpenter in Sault Ste. Marie who lives in a parking lot. That's not an unusual story these days. You know, it's crazy to think the guys who build our homes can't afford to live in them. But that's the state of it. After 8 years of Trudeau.
What is this so-called real estate bubble in Canada, and how has it become what it is today?
Not only do we have housing issues, but we got places all over the country. This is the issue no one wants to talk about. No one's living in these places.
Yeah.
Where's the money coming from? I don't know. But no one's living in these places.
Canada could be sitting on the biggest housing bubble of all time. That's according to one strategist who's warning that once it bursts, Canada could be thrown into a deeper recession.
In the late 2000s, the average cost of a home in Canada was worth $301,000 Canadian, which is approximately $261,000 USD at the time. On August 13th, one home was worth over $719,000. But the question is, why? What you're looking at, depending on who you ask, is either the greatest investment on earth or the biggest real estate bubble in the world.
How the hell is anyone existing in Canada? I feel trapped.
It's simple to me. Canada needs more people. Canadians understand the need to continue to grow our population if we're going to meet the needs of the labor force.
In the view of Vancouver's majestic skyline, an unsettling truth lingers.
Well, a new poll suggests that support for increased immigration is faltering. The online Leger poll found that 75% of respondents agreed an increase in newcomers is adding strain to both the housing market and healthcare system. Now, the same amount acknowledged higher immigration contributes to cultural diversity, while a majority agreed young immigrants contribute to the workforce and tax base. Nearly half of those who answered the online survey said Canada should welcome fewer immigrants.
As property values have continued to skyrocket, Canadian incomes have lagged far behind, pushing households into a hellish amount of debt. While everyone understands the importance of owning their own home, the younger generation, including millennials and Gen Z, often label this market as scam.
Our economy basically is based on two things. One is real estate and the other is energy. And the folks in Ottawa have deemed energy and commodities not a growth sector. And we got the Bank of Canada raising rates. Common sense suggests that the economy is going to go down.
Others praise it extensively, saying that this is the only asset class that continues to rise, and the market will never cool off, or that things like immigration will continue to support these prices. Even Prime Minister Justin Trudeau has hinted that they support this current market condition in order to fund the retirement of the boomer generation.
But housing needs to retain its value. It's a huge part of people's potential for retirement and future and nest egg. So yes, we need to keep housing stable and valuable.
The big six banks in Canada have now all began to prepare for massive defaults and bankruptcy within the next 2 years. But with the Bank of Canada now lowering interest rates to about 4.25%, it seems that to me that even the central bankers understand that there's cracks beginning to form in the market.
Overall weakness in the economy continues to pull inflation down, but price pressures in shelter and some other services are holding inflation up. Since the July NPR, the upward forces coming from prices for shelter and some other services have eased slightly. At the same time, the downward pressure coming from excess supply in the economy remains. If inflation continues to ease broadly in line with our July forecast, it is reasonable to expect further cuts in our policy interest rate. We will continue to assess the opposing forces on inflation and take our monetary policy decisions one at a time.
You see, bankruptcies, foreclosures, and rate cuts are only a small part of what makes this ongoing saga fascinating. And truthfully, I think it's time that you and I finally take a step back into the realm of the world's largest real estate bubble and make sense of it all. Canada's real estate market has long been considered the cornerstone of the nation's economy, a true symbol of stability and prosperity. But over the last 2 decades, the landscape has shifted dramatically. What was once a predictable market tied to economic growth has become a high-stakes game driven by speculation, foreign investment, and unprecedented demand. To understand the current state of the market, we need to take a look back at the factors that shaped it, which are immigration, urban development, and government policies designed to fuel growth. These forces laid the groundwork for a market that would eventually become a global talking point. Imagine, it's the mid-1990s in Canada.
Now, a 24th Stanley Cup banner will hang from the rafters of the famous Forum in Montreal. The Canadiens win the Stanley Cup.
The pitch on the way, a swing and a belt. Left field, way back. Blue Jays win it. The Blue Jays are World Series champions.
Mortgages are more affordable. Prices seem reasonable. Yet, for Canada's home builders at the time, 1995 is one of the toughest years since World War II.
Mortgage rates in Canada had already started to fall as financial institutions anticipated today's interest rate drop. Some rates have come down to 14.5%. That compares to a recent high of 17.5%. One man who is breathing a sigh of relief is Gary Martin. He was facing a mortgage renewal at the end of this month and had been told it would be 16.5%. That will now be lower, but not low enough for him.
Now that they've dropped down to 15%, 14.5%, a lot of people feel that, that is a bargain. Personally, no, I don't think it's a bargain at all. I'd like to see an interest rate of 10% for everybody. I don't know if that's possible.
If Martin is lucky enough to get a 14% mortgage, he will save about $61 a month on his $33,000 loan, and compared to the 16.5% mortgage he was first quoted by the bank. But some real estate experts are already predicting that rates are at a temporary low and may rise again.
Consumer confidence in the real estate market completely plummeted, leading to a dramatic slowdown in the sales of new homes. You see, home ownership is a key part of the Western vision. It's a part of the very thing that influences many of our actions today. Even in this era, Canada had began a radical shift in its demographics as immigration became a more welcomed part of Canadian society. About 2.2 million immigrants came to Canada in the 1990s, accounting for over half of the population growth during that period, and representing the largest number of entrants for any decade in the past century. Despite the rise in immigration, Canada was able to support this due to the available infrastructure and highly vetting process that warranted the growth. During this time, on a national level, the vacancy rates for the rental housing in Canada generally ranged between 3 and 6% throughout the decade, with the median rent being $500 to $800 within the decade for a 2-bedroom apartment. The country was grappling with high interest rates and a severe economic recession, which caused a significant slowdown in housing activity. According to data from the Canada Mortgage and Housing Corporation, the CMHC, housing starts and completions dropped and property prices stagnated or even declined in some regions during this period. The mid-1990s saw a particularly sharp downturn with reduced consumer confidence and decreased demand for new homes. However, by the late 1990s, the market began to recover, and a combination of declining interest rates, a robust economy, and increased immigration continued to contribute to the renewed demand for housing. Statistic Canada showed that home ownership rates started to climb again for the first time in a decade, and building permits for new housing projects increased, signaling a resurgence in market activity. The Canadian government's policies during this period, which encouraged home ownership and supported the economic stability of the nation, played a crucial role in this recovery. The early 2000s saw continued economic expansion, further reductions in interest rates, and a boom in immigration, all factors that fueled the demand for housing. The CMHC reports that from this period, property prices across major urban centers like Toronto, Vancouver, and Calgary all saw increases. Funny enough, this period saw the introduction of new mortgage products and more lenient lending practices, which made it easier for Canadians to purchase homes. While these developments initially led to a dramatic growth, they also laid the foundation for the vulnerabilities that would later contribute to this real estate bubble. By 2007, the Canadian housing market saw property prices at record highs. However, this growth was not without any risk. The market's resilience would soon be tested by the global financial crisis to come.
We've had an 8-day losing streak in the Dow that in percentage terms puts it on par, close to the loss suffered in that crash in 1987, close to that percentage loss those 2 days in 1929.
What started in America last year has now spread to every part of the world.
We're down 9% today. The Xetra DAX over in Frankfurt is down by 9%. The Paris market down by 9%. Austria, which was briefly suspended earlier on in the day, is down by nearly 11%.
This market is as volatile as you'll ever see.
Traders saying this is the craziest day they have ever seen in these markets. Veteran traders saying they've never seen anything like it. The movement in oil prices so fast, so fast.
Seconds to go until the start of trading at the New York Stock Exchange, and stocks are set to kick off lower, a whole lot lower.
eBay is down 6.5%. Really, you're seeing just broad-based declines across all of the major technology sectors. Apple's under pressure. Yahoo down 8.5%. Cisco 6.5%. Research in Motion 10%.
This could be the most serious recession in decades. And that means life, as most Americans know it, is about to change, in some cases dramatically.
The 2008 financial crisis left a lasting impact on the global economies, with the US housing market at the epicenter of all of the turmoil. As interest rates continued to rise and unsustainable lending practices unraveled, the US experienced a catastrophic collapse in its housing sector. Mortgage delinquency surged, and home prices plummeted by nearly 20% and even worse in some markets, making it one of the most severe economic downturns in American history. From its peak in 2008 to the trough in 2009, the Canadian housing prices only declined on average 9.2%, which was a modest drop compared to the devastating losses seen in the US, with some places losing over 50% of its value. While it took nearly a decade for the US property values to recover from the 2008 financial crisis, the Canadian real estate market was different. It bounced back in just 2 years. The resilience of the Canadian housing market was largely attributed to Canada's conservative mortgage lending practices and its so-called robust, well-regulated banking industry at the time.
We've had 15 years of successive surpluses, so we've gone into this crisis with a much stronger fiscal position than many other countries, which I think has served us well. Most of our entitlement programs, whether it's healthcare, Social Security, are fully funded. So I think the foundation in Canada has been quite strong.
Our mortgage market is based on sound credit quality. We did not have investors staying away, for instance, from our mortgage market. We did not have this collapse of the availability of credit. We did not have this big rise in interest rates. So that's the first thing that gave that safeguard. And as I said, because we have this mortgage default insurance, lenders did not have this knee-jerk reaction of staying away from the market because they knew they could continue doing mortgage origination under the protection of this program.
Canadian banks have always been known for their prudence, their caution, and their care, particularly when it comes to lending. And this is sometimes seen as a national characteristic, but it certainly is true of the management of Canadian banks.
This conservative approach shielded Canada from probably some of the worst parts of the global financial crisis, but it also had unintended consequences at the same time. While the US real estate market slumped temporarily, it made homes more affordable over there, but Canada never really saw a similar correction. At the time, Canadian politicians and monetary policy was heavily influenced by the US, which had a totally different and yet worse situation on their hands to combat. But the Canadians decided to follow them anyway.
This is US private sector debt to GDP. So this is basically the debt that companies and corporations have. So you can see that that debt bubble started building in the 1990s during the dot-com bubble. And basically the US's response to that bubble bursting was, guess what? lower interest rates, and then that will stimulate the economy. So they lowered interest rates to the floor, and then that started up the massive household debt bubble that you can see happened on this chart right here. Now, the difference is this chart and the Canadian chart are very, very similar, but it was more extreme for the US at that time within the first 10 years of that bubble forming. Now, another thing that I want to show you is the private sector debt to GDP, which again, it's debt held by businesses. And basically you can see from this chart, it did not start rising until around 2006. And essentially this is what saved Canada in 2008 was this private sector debt, because essentially what happened was companies didn't have that much debt. So when credit conditions tightened, even though interest rates were coming down, guess what? Canadian businesses didn't have that much debt, so they were okay. And the fact is, because of that, that meant that people retained their jobs and there was less prolonged unemployment that occurred during that time. Now, another thing I want to show you back to the US chart, which is household debt, and you can basically see how this starts falling before even the 2008 crisis hits. It actually starts falling around the start of 2008, and the Lehman Brothers moment didn't happen until October 2008, and that was really the financial system implosion. And it was a global financial system implosion that affected many other countries like the UK and Ireland, Portugal and Spain. It had far-reaching consequences. You can see that that line starts falling, and that is because credit is starting to be destroyed. This sent asset prices into free fall and created a huge recession in the US, because the US had built a lot of its economy around the 2008 bubble, and Canada has been warned multiple times that it has even greater exposure to things like the housing market bubble bursting than the US did back in 2008, and that is a scary thought to say the least. You're probably thinking, Luke, well, what caused that crisis to happen? And a lot of people will say it was subprime lending, but data that has come out recently actually shows that's not the case. The main reason and the root cause of the 2008 crisis was low interest rates. Now, does that not sound familiar to you? Exactly the same cause as what happened in Japan. But basically, low interest rates, they fueled inflation, they forced a tightening cycle, and then guess what? That burst the bubble. So interest rates weren't actually the main cause of the crash in asset prices. I want to make that clear to you. Interest rates were just the pin being took to the bubble, but the actual crash in asset prices didn't occur until the recession hit and unemployment was widespread. In 2006 to 2008, there was a time where housing prices were coming down, and they were coming down substantially, 20 to 30% in some areas, after a sort of mania occurred in the housing market. Now, doesn't that sound familiar? Because that is exactly what is happening over the course of 2022. And a lot of people saw that who had FOMO as a signal to buy, because they think that asset prices and debt markets are like a supermarket when they are not. So they think that they are getting a deal, but they are actually sticking their hand out and trying to catch a falling knife. And that is a devastating thing to do. These people unfortunately got caught up, and they were collateral damage to everything that occurred with the financial implosion. And it will probably be very similar in Canada, as we are seeing the exact same patterns play out right now.
By the 2010s, the seeds of a housing bubble were being sown. Housing prices began to skyrocket, driven by low interest rates, foreign investment, and the belief that real estate was a fail-safe investment. But as prices soared, so did the concerns.
That's the key question. I mean, Vancouver market, of course, is the prices in that market have been, what I would argue, is completely detached from household incomes for a number of years. In fact, there was an article in the Globe and Mail today about concern now that there's been sort of cases of flipping and speculation in the Vancouver market, which isn't a surprise to us because we think it's all just a credit-driven asset bubble. Part of it to do with foreign investors flooding in. But I think there's more to the story than just that. I think it's just a reflection of the easy credit, low interest rates, and the market there really is just out of control. And so I'm not surprised to hear these stories of flipping that we've seen in today's Globe and Mail. As far as how long it can go on for, well, that's a $1 million question. It's not really been driven by economic fundamentals. So, when some people ask us, what would be a trigger for a correction in the Vancouver housing market? Well, in my mind, that's like asking what's a rational trigger for an irrational market. So
these warnings were often drowned out by the ongoing boom. Ordinary Canadians, meanwhile, were finding it harder and harder to enter the market.
With prices on a tear and extreme bidding wars the norm, homeownership seems even further out of reach for him and his fiancée.
We were looking, and the houses in Guelph a year ago were $400,000, $500,000. Now they're like $600,000 to $800,000 a year later. How does that happen?
The increases in the Canadian housing market has far outprogressed the mere 24% increase in hourly wages during that same period. Today, it's estimated that a minimum income of $180,000 Canadian is required to afford the average property price of $750,000 in Canadian. Yet, the median family income sits at approximately $121,000, which is 33% below the amount needed for home ownership at these current rates. As a result, the traditional concept of home ownership has become increasingly unattainable for many young Canadians. This has turned what was once considered the cornerstone of the Canadian dream into a nightmare. However, this story may be contributing to a larger and more insidious problem. With the low interest rate environment that persisted over the decade following the 2008 financial crisis, and with Canada being a stable country politically and economically at the time, this attracted a ton of foreign investment, which played a large role in the number of vacant homes currently being wasted around the Greater Toronto and Greater Vancouver areas.
Who are they building these homes for? Foreigners. Some of who buy these homes make their money overseas. If you trace some of this money back, the prospect of organized crime comes up. One example of this is the Triad, arguably one of the most powerful organized crime syndicates in the world. Based around China, this organization produces most of the illicit substances you see in North America. So how do these gangs tie in with Canadian real estate? Let's start in 2013, when President Xi Jinping was appointed to centralize power with a mandate to remove corruption. After tens of thousands began to be arrested, Asian casino revenues dropped. These casinos, interestingly, were the easiest ways to launder money, having no requirement to report large transactions. As soon as these crackdowns occurred, dollar volume in Canadian real estate began to rise. With no proof of income, you need a 35% down payment to buy a home. But with the Canadian banking system, it's a piece of cake. Just open more bank accounts and have friends and family lend you money in 50,000 increments. Now you have a down payment and your money is now clean. Meet Steve, one of the few talkative longtime locals in the GTA area that we were able to talk to.
So what do you think about all these empty homes here around Toronto?
I think it's a travesty. We have a housing problem. We are letting in all the refugees. We have nowhere to put them. Meanwhile, we have probably $300 million worth of property up on top of the hill here that's vacant.
Who's buying all these homes, and why are they sitting all like this?
It's mostly the Asians and the Russians, but the Russians don't seem to leave them vacant for vacant as long. But if you go and just take a drive at the top here, you'll see that most of the real estate agents are Asian, and there's lots of good Asian people in this country, but I just think this particular situation is a travesty, and I think it's sad. Like when you go downtown and see what's going on with veterans, and you see what's going on with people that can't afford groceries because the taxes were just put up in the city by 9.5%, and this country was locked down longer than any country basically in the G7. I just think that the leadership of this country is astoundingly negligent. It's blatantly obvious what's going on. It's not a racial thing. It's just what's happening. And the truth is the truth. And if you're afraid to say it, then you're going to keep getting stepped on.
While there are more affordable options in rural towns across Canada, the country's population is heavily concentrated in its cities. Approximately 3/4 of Canadians live in large urban centers, and its urban density is steadily increasing. Between 2016 and 2021, Canada experienced double the population growth of every other G7 country with a 5.2% increase, which was primarily driven by immigration. In 2022 alone, Canada's population surged by 2.7%, making it for the first time in history that over 1 million people were welcomed in a single year. This rapid population growth, especially in larger cities, has placed a significant pressure on the Canadian housing market. Although immigration, while it's validated for supporting the economy and addressing Canada's aging population, it has also intensified the demand for housing in these urban centers. Unlike cities in the US with similar or higher population densities such as New York or San Francisco, Canada's housing market has become notably unaffordable. This raises the question, what makes Canada's housing market so uniquely expensive? A key factor is the significant lack of housing supply. Canada has the lowest housing supply per capita among G7 nations, with only 424 units per 1,000 people. The Federal Housing Agency estimates that Canada would need to build 5.8 million new homes by 2030 to restore affordability. That's 2.5 times the current rate of construction. While the solution might seem straightforward, build more homes, there are several obstacles that make it more challenging. Firstly, there's a severe shortage of skilled labor in the construction sector, with Canada experiencing a record high of 80,000 vacancies. This shortage is one of the reasons why immigration is viewed as a potential solution to the housing crisis rather than the problem. However, as time passes, we can see that the data tells a different story.
About 20 years ago when I came to Canada, same thing like your parents, there was a point system, so you get points for education, you get points for work experience, and then for things like knowledge of either English or French, and age, because you don't want very old people to be migrating, even though they may be educated, English speaking or French speaking with work experience. But if someone is trying to come here at 60, that's not what we are looking for. So it was
it's like a job interview
design
in a way.
Yeah. And it was designed that way. But by the time I came about 20 years ago, there were serious problems with it, because the overseas education and work experience were not recognized in the Canadian job market. So the idea was, let's take this international study permit policy and link it with immigration, so that we are bringing people over at a much younger age compared to, let's say, people in their 30s or early 40s, because it was open up to the age of 44. Instead of that, let's bring in people at, let's say, 18 or 20 or 22 years of age. Let them come here for studies, so they have a local certification. In the process of studies, they have worked maybe 20 hours on campus, or during winter and summer breaks, they have worked 40 hours. They have done their co-ops. So now they have enough work experience in Canada. So the idea was to bypass the difficulty that the immigrants themselves were facing, the ones coming on point system. Unfortunately, this policy was hijacked and made into something that's a completely different beast. So instead of getting, let's say, about 200,000 students a year, now we are getting 900,000 students a year.
We can see that the jobs currently being filled by immigration are not the ones that are required for economic growth, which is why at the current moment, it seems that immigration is not helping fill that void of the worker shortage in the construction sector. There's tons of bureaucracy and red tape, which has made the process of building new homes very slow and very annoying to deal with.
This is a fundamentally different approach than what we see from the current Liberal government. What they propose, what they currently do with their so-called housing accelerator program, is they fund box ticking. Put together a bunch of boxes that municipalities have to tick for procedural and bureaucratic reforms. Once the boxes are ticked, the money is sent, and we move on. The problem is that even if those are the right boxes to tick, and ultimately the municipality ticks them, when the feds turn their back, the city can then put in place a bunch of new obstacles. For example, municipalities like Ottawa and Toronto have actually jacked up development charges after getting federal housing accelerator funds. The city of Winnipeg got federal funding and then blocked 2,000 homes right next to a federal transit station. That's why trying to manage process will get you nowhere. When you pay for bureaucratic box ticking, you get bureaucratic box ticking. But you can't live in a box ticked by a bureaucrat. You have to live in a home.
In Toronto, for example, it can take up to 8 to 10 years to move from acquiring an undeveloped land to completing construction. These efforts have yet to show significant progress in increasing housing supply or providing some sort of relief for the market. As more Canadians were pushed out of the housing market and the socioeconomic divide began to widen, homeownership, once a cornerstone of the Canadian dream, was becoming extremely exclusive and accessible only to those with significant financial means or those willing to take on substantial debt. For many, it meant sacrificing other aspects of their lives. The less money for retirement savings, education, or even basic necessities. With credit cards being relied on more in this system and unemployment figures becoming more of a threat, it seems that these two forces will eventually lead to a disaster. Looking forward, the challenge is clear: to build a housing market that is stable, accessible, and equitable. As Canada rebuilds, the focus will be on ensuring that the mistakes of the past are not repeated, and the dream of home ownership remains within reach for all Canadians.